up, everybody? Gonna be a solo one today. Andrew's coming back from the mountains. Lots of skiing. He's working the snow poles. Is that what they call those? Little skiing poles? Something like that. I don't know what's going on over there. But he's skiing. He's having some fun. He'll be back for our PWCC episode tomorrow. I want to give a thanks to the folks at Bleecker. Visited their trade night this past week. Check out the little Bleecker trading hat that we got going on there. A lot of people in the house at Bleecker. And always fun. Always a lot of fun. You know, Bagels, PC, they were hosting it. You had PSA there, Beckett there. A bunch of other dignitaries. Like I said, Bagels. The Car Talk guys were there. It was just a lot of fun. That's like a second hobby home for me. So just appreciate the little Bleecker trading hat and that kind of fun stuff. So anyway, that's a minute and it's a waste right there. I'm sorry. You listen to me like, get to the point, Cage. It's 911. Episode 911. So I was thinking to myself, what do we do with 911? What do we do with episode 911? That's like an emergency, right? It's a call. It's an emergency phone call, emergency assistance. I figured, let me give my 911 operator 911 emergency assistance episode out to the hobby. This is me. I'm going to give you the emergency assistance that you guys need. And I titled this episode here today, What Can Today's Collectors Learn from Yesterday? I've been thinking about this since last night. That's a long time to think for me. I happen to be, downstairs watching TV with my son. We put the NBA channel on NBA TV in the lead up to the games. And, we'll wait for games to start. We have the NBA package, but wait for games to start. And NBA TV's got some really cool, shows on. They have, they talk about like different draft classes. And the show we watched, and I was like, yeah, buddy, if you want me to take this off, we can put on what you like. He says, no, I'm actually enjoying this. It was Ray Allen shooting 3-pointers. But it was basically, a show for the different decades of basketball and what happened and who did what and the records and the whole deal. And we watched this glued to the screen, watching the players, watching the plays. And this decade that we watched was the 2010s, right? The 2010 to 2019, basically, right? The decade right before this, right? It ended, talking about Luka coming in and, Luka Magic, I think was the last thing we watched. They threw a little bit of Luka in for the kids because, he was there during that decade, towards the end of it. But I was really taken aback by all of the cool things that happened in that decade and how they sort of mirror what we have going on in this decade already, and how you can look at those accomplishments, what players did there, and, maybe extrapolate that into this decade, and with the thriving hobby that we have now, a very different hobby that we have now than there was in place, to start off the 2010s, to think about what would have happened had some of those things occurred and the hobby was as robust as it is today. And another way to look at it is compare players that people are collecting now to people who were accomplishing similar things back in the 2010s and think about their collector base now that they are no longer playing or where they are in their careers now. It was an interesting thing, and it really got me thinking, especially when combined it with, my Brock Purdy analysis. People probably done hearing about Brock Purdy. We'll see whether or not he shows up this week in the championship game. When people are comparing him to Tom Brady, and I compared him to Mark Sanchez. And I do this. I have this ability to be, I guess, a little pessimistic, or some might say realistic, right? Purdy, sure, Tom Brady was great, came in as sort of an irrelevant late-round pick and, accomplished a lot in his 8 games. But everybody wants to compare him to, he's going to win 7 Super Bowls. But in reality, Mark Sanchez is also a fair comp, because in his rookie year, he went on to go to the AFC Championship game, actually winning 2 road playoff games. And then in his second year, went on to do it again. Went on to beat Manning and Brady, and then ultimately lose to Ben Roethlisberger in the AFC Championship game. So you could argue that when 2011 came around and Sanchez had 2 years under his belt, he was very accomplished, but by 2018 he was out of the league. So I try to do this not to kind of throw ice water on stuff, but just because, those who forget, what do I say? Those who, forget the past are doomed to repeat it, right? One of those kind of things, right? So let's talk about the past. In 2010s, sure, we could talk about how it was, the 2010 decade was ushered in by the decision and LeBron coming in. And, obviously LeBron has been great since he came into the league. But a lot of people forget, right there in the beginning of the we had these rookies, sort of like, John Morant, rookies who take the league by storm. These guys who came in and they were just, exciting and doing things that no one had done before. And in 2011, at 22 years of age, Derrick Rose led the Chicago Bulls to 50-something wins, their most successful season since Michael Jordan, and an MVP award. Think about that. At 22 years old in 2011, imagine that happened now. Imagine a 22-year-old kid. Imagine, Cade Cunningham's injured, but imagine one of these guys, an Evan Mobley or Ja last year, or one of these guys, came out and won the MVP. And look, you can't predict injuries, and obviously D Rose has been bit by that injury bug, but it got me thinking about how crazy it would have been in 2011, or if we had a rookie now who went on and, was basically the clear-cut leader of the team, out there doing his thing, winning the MVP at 22 years old and, taking his team into the playoffs. It's crazy stuff. And I know, Ja was, close to that last year. He didn't win the MVP, obviously, but he was, he was in the running. He had a great season. But it's one of those things where I'm watching this and I'm like, all right, we have a lot of rookies now. None of them were, a Derrick Rose at 22 years old. Not yet. I guess we'll see. Maybe Victor Wembanyama comes in and does that. We'll see. But they could also turn into a Derrick Rose, even if they win that MVP at 22 years old. You want to go even further and go more towards the, the flash in the pan type of stuff. I can only imagine what would happen if a Linsanity type event happened now. Back in 2012, I think it was February to March, and they had Linsanity, the craziness, lighting up the Madison Square Garden, started with a 25-point game and just not stopping. And unfortunately, injury also. He hurt his knee, he had he played for a couple years. But wow, the hysteria, especially here in New York. Any rookie can kind of catch on, right? And, what I learned from, Linsanity, watching it when I did back in 2012 is, a rookie, any player now can catch fire for a couple games if given an opportunity. In that one, it was no Carmelo Anthony. So somebody had to fill the vacuum. Somebody had to fill the void. And, I'll even make a fun comparison, much closer to now. I remember buying cheaper, because the hobby had not exploded yet, Devontae Graham cards. You guys hear me talk about it all the time, right? And he went on a little bit of a run there where he was averaging 20 points. He scored 40 points against the Nets, and all of a sudden it's like, boom. Linsanity is the bowl type of thing, right? So you can have fun with it. You can invest in it. You can, put some money and just be careful because, every one of those guys that turns into something, great. Every Desmond Bain that kind of comes out of nowhere and becomes a good second option on a team, there's probably 10 Linsanities or Devontae Grahams out there. And it's just one of those fun things to learn. What really got me started on this, though, was, everybody's Steph. And I'm not making a Steph comparison to this guy. Steph is in a league of his own. But, so was this guy. And I'm gonna make a point now. Maybe it's this guy should get some more hobby love than he gets. Because he showed up in two moments in time in this 2010s decade. Or maybe it's just one of those important things that we have to keep in the back of our mind about collectibles and about collector base and how, someone has a lot more fans, a lot more demand when they're playing as opposed to, I don't want to say being slightly forgotten, but being slightly forgotten. We're going to get to a couple of other guys who kind of fall into that category, but I'm talking about none other than Ray Allen, who had two big moments in that 2011 and 2013 years. Number one, in 2011, you guys probably remember Steph Curry just broke the three-point record. Well, in 2011, the same type of hoopla and hysteria was going on. This is what got me thinking about potentially coming on and talking to you guys and doing an episode like this today, because I watched this and I'm like, wow, that's just like what just happened with Steph. Now, Steph did in like 400 less games we get it. Steph's a different player than Ray Allen. Ray Allen's a pretty damn good player. And there, Reggie Miller is there, and he's hugging him. He broke the record, and he more threes than anybody else. And wow, Ray Allen, the greatest shooter, you name it. And then you combine that with a year and a half after that in 2013, the huge Game 6 shot that Ray Allen hit for the Heat on their way to beating the Spurs in the 2013 finals, where they went on to win in Game 7, but they wouldn't have got to that Game 7 if it wasn't for Ray Allen and that shot in Game 6. So here we have, a guy like Ray Allen who, he has championships. One of the most prolific three-point shooters, sharpshooters in the game's history, was the record holder until you had Steph come along and beat him. Had this, moment in time here where in the early 2010s, in that decade, he was breaking records, he was winning championships, he was hitting big shots. And yet, I don't know too many Ray Allen collectors. Obviously I'm not going to compare him to Steph per se, right? But he's definitely better than a lot of, folks that are, collecting. It really is an interesting thing to, to think about. I know people collected Ray Allen 10, 15 years ago, and I don't really see too many Ray Allen collectors now. And, this whole thing, this whole chat is kind of about that, right? I mean, it's I've started talking about this, the demand fall off after somebody retires because, their body of work is done, their book has been written, and they're not adding any more chapters to it. But it's one of those things that, I think we probably should pay a little more attention to when investing in current players, when, taking that flyer on it. Sure, it's a gamble, and I'm not saying anything probably a lot of you don't already know and don't realize. It was just a real eye-opener to me because we sat there, we watched this, and I'm like, okay, well, this just happened with Steph, and I can see that, Derrick Rose, John Morant comparison. And then they went on after that year, the Spurs came in 2014 and got their revenge. They came back and beat the Heat in 2014. And I'm like, wow, the Spurs beat the Heat, that, that super team that, LeBron was on. And I thought about it. I'm like, yeah, Tim Duncan was on that team. And Tim Duncan doesn't really get the love that he probably should. You guys know I have bought some Tim Duncan cards recently. But Tim Duncan didn't lead that team in scoring. He did not. Who led the team in scoring? Tony Parker. You guys remember that name? I think he's up for Hall of Fame consideration in the next year or two. And you had Manu Ginobili on that team. Another guy who's up for Hall of Fame consideration. So let's talk about those two guys for a second. Actually, you know what? Manu, great guy. Nobody really, he got a little small segment of collectors. But he would compare to, some of these guys now, these all-stars that people are paying big money for. And Tony Parker, the same thing. I mean, lots of rings, assist leader, really great player who there are not that many people out there that collect. But what really caught me about the 2014 team and about that decade was, who else was on that 2014 Spurs team? A young Kawhi Leonard, who I did a little research, and there were people who, after he won there, after he won in Toronto, when he had won finals MVPs with two teams, people were calling, because that happened later in this decade too, people were saying this could be the next Michael Jordan. Even though he was an odd duck, Kawhi Leonard was this defender who also played offense, and he was somebody who was like kryptonite to LeBron. And at the end of the decade, he was moving on to, to pair up with Paul George and go to the Clippers and really be a thorn in the side of LeBron out in the West. And just like Linsanity before him and Derrick Rose before him, obviously, different caliber players, the injury bug and or load management has really deprived us of seeing what Kawhi might have been able to do with a full career. Now he's back healthy and playing now, but I don't see too many people, on the Kawhi bandwagon the way that they were previously. I remember the hysteria around him, and I remember reading articles. I found some articles similar to the ones that I found about Mark Sanchez in 2010, talking about Kawhi being the next great. I pulled up a top 50 NBA countdown on ESPN as the decade ended. And after Kawhi had won, Defensive Player of the Year and had won 2 championships with 2 different teams and was moving, and, the thought was he could win more, there were many, many publications that put him, in the top 50 NBA players, close to top 25 NBA players. And that was not only based on what he had done, but on what everybody, figured he was going to do. And Kawhi's kind of one of those forgotten players. And I remember, a couple years ago when 2012 Prism was my jam, right? And let's grade some 2012 Prism. And Kawhi was the card. Kawhi was the guy that people were going after. He was the top, rookie card in that set. You wanted your Kawhi. You wanted your Clay. You wanted your Anthony Davis. He's got Dame Lillard. You wanted your Bradley Beal. Your Kemba Walker. For those of you not looking on YouTube, I'm making faces after almost every one of these names because it's funny how in just a couple of years since that set was really starting to be collected and graded in 18, 19, 20, how those players who were looked at one way are now kind of all looked at in a different way, unless you're Cajun. Cajun still looks at Dame Lillard the same way, and I can't really, put too much disrespect on Dame's name. He just dropped 60 the other night, so he's just he's still doing his thing. But those other guys, not so much. But the funny thing was, I watched this 2014 Spurs, and they went on this whole thing about how Kawhi was the guy. Kawhi was, dare I say, him, or he was going to be the next him, and now instead of asking when, we're asking Kawhi. So, that was a fun one, right? Not to mention Tony Parker and, Manu Ginobili and Tim Duncan. That team was a juggernaut. That team was a dynasty team. And, there's not many folks that collect any of those guys. Maybe it's because none of them were full-on superstars. Kawhi, I guess, could have been, but interesting stuff, we're having fun with this one, and I think my favorite one, and maybe I'll close it out with this way. I didn't go too much because you guys are getting the point, right? This is episode 911. It's the emergency call out. It's the, hey, let's talk about these people who were great and how after a great season or a great couple seasons or even a great career, within a couple of years, these greats are, I don't want to say forgotten, but not collected. Maybe that changes. Maybe there's an appreciation for them 10, 15 years down the road. We've talked about this, interspersed in other episodes here and there. I talked about how Tony Gwynn was starting to get some more love now on his cards. But, there are a myriad of all-time great players that do not get collected and do not get the respect that they deserve. And it really, what that means, whether you're an NBA player, and that's what I'm focusing on today, or an NFL player, or whatever it is, think about all of the greats. Think about all of the people who, played at a high level and just don't really have much in the way of collectability. Quarterbacks who won multiple Super Bowls. Look at Troy Aikman. You know what I mean? Just not heavily collected. He didn't have the stats, and it was really Emmitt Smith's team and, the whole deal. But there are, I can name plenty of other folks in all sports who have the stats, did great things, and will probably end up with significantly better careers than 90% of the rookie classes that are coming out now. I don't want to pour too much ice water on it, but I end this with the 2017 season. It was a 16-17, that 2017 season, where a player averaged 31.6 points, 10.7 rebounds, and 10.4 assists, and broke what was thought of at the time as an unbreakable record, and averaged a triple-double for the season. And we're talking about none other than Russell Westbrook. And, I could only imagine how crazy it would be today or last year, if somebody during this hobby rush were able to do this, insanity that Russell Westbrook did for an entire season, obviously, MVP season there, if they were to do it now, what would happen to their cards? And yet if you fast forward, you turn the clock 5 years forward, Russ Westbrook, I honestly think, he doesn't get the respect that he deserves. But, right now, there's a few Westbrook collectors. He's coming off the bench. He's thought of as kind of like a joke. Andrew called Josh Allen the Russell Westbrook of the NFL, which I don't think he meant as a compliment because the sentence before that he called him a fraud. And yet, only a couple of years ago, you had this guy going for 31, 10, and 10. And while we like to invest in that potential of these players, we like to think, okay, somebody who can do that, they'll do it for a bunch of years and they can do it over their whole career and win some championships, and boom, that's the guy, that's the next him. You know, sometimes they're not. Sometimes that's the best that you're going to get out of a player, and as the the potential turns into something that doesn't materialize, you know, an investment in cards after that greatness, after that flash in the pan, after that one great year, often more often than not, as I watch from the 2010s, sure there are Steph Currys that show up out of that year, out of that decade, and dominate, and they've turned into great investments and will turn into top 12, top 10 players of all time. LeBron as well, great during the decade. You could argue Kevin Durant, although his cards have kind of gotten a little bit beat up. We can do that, but Luka might have a 60-point triple double. But what I learned watching the show was so did James Harden during that decade. And I love James Harden. I think he's got a great offensive game, and I think his stats and his numbers are fantastic. But not a lot of people out there putting a whole bunch of money into James Harden right now. So, it was a fun watch. It was an interesting kind of like, I can't wait to go to like Mint or, another trade night, or just hang out and, grab a beer or get into one of the Luka Nation chat rooms that we have, and just start talking about this. And, not to bring up Gary Vee, but it's one of the things that he actually said when he got into the hobby. And he said, be careful investing in a lot of younger guys, because, these guys would all sign on the dotted line for Chris Bosh's career with championships and the numbers that he put up. These guys would all sign on the dotted line for Ray Allen's career. But there are not a lot of people out there who are collecting Ray Allen when all is said and done, who are collecting Chris Bosh when all is said and done. It's actually, a pretty smart way to think about it. You collect who you like, you collect who you love, collect the whole 9 yards. But, right now, the way that the hobby is kind of rookie focused and focused on like, wow, look what's going on today, without really thinking about, is it something that can, continue into the future? Can we have sustained, this type of success going forward? The downside risk, I guess, may not justify the upside. One of my favorite collectors out there, I bring him up on the show every now and again, Josh Cardboard Chronicles. He has a really cool way of collecting greats after the fact, right? And, he picked up Todd Gurley cards. I saw him recently start to buy some Larry Fitzgerald cards. Those guys' books are written, and there's not a lot of people chasing their stuff right now, so you can kind of get their best stuff after the fact, collect them, appreciate them. And, there is an argument to be made that maybe more savvy collectors will do that with some of these other players who simply are not getting the respect that they deserve presently, right? I mean, the argument against what I've said for the last 20 minutes, that these guys just don't get collected, is, well, right now they don't. And maybe there will be a groundswell in 5 or 10 years of love for a Tim Duncan, or for a Russell Westbrook, or for a James Harden, or, for Ray Allen, for these guys who did it for a decade, these guys who hit big shots, who won championships, who set records, and they're just not in the news today. They're not out there winning. They're not winning another championship, but they were greats of a decade. And maybe it just takes a little while for the collecting hobby to start to, take a look back and appreciate those guys for what they were. And maybe the flip side to me saying stay away from these guys because, look, these guys aren't worth so much money, is maybe those guys start to get valued a little bit more as we go forward. Remains to be seen. I could see that happening 100% because some of their stuff does seem a little cheap. Don't really own too much, but you guys know I started buying some Tim Duncan, so I'm an example of that myself. Who knows who that may happen for. Didn't want to spend too much on this. I've almost spent, half the amount of time that you could just watch this whole show yourself on NBA TV if you want. But, to me, worth a discussion, worth some talking points, worth coming on here and chatting with you about. It's tough doing 25 minutes without drinking some soda, man. I gotta tell you, I got a cup right here. It's staring at me. It's calling me. But I'll end the recording and I'll take a sip myself. Hope you guys enjoyed this. If you got any other topics you want me to kind of, chime in about, that's great. I don't want to be viewed as a, pessimist or anything like that. It's just one of those things that hit me, while we were watching that show on TV, and, it made me think about, like, I almost wanted to do a comparison to all of these guys in these decades, but I'll leave that to you guys. I'll leave that to your imagination. You can probably come up with some real good comparisons. Have fun out there collecting, and we'll see you tomorrow with our PWCC episode. Thanks, everybody.